Well, thank you, Mike, for the introduction. Thank you to this impact group for this amazing program that you're doing. What a pleasure to be here and learn about it. And thank you to all of you for the honor of being able to share some thoughts with you today. And thank you to Dr. Sarah for so nicely setting up the question that I mainly want to ask. Could animal production become a profession? Perhaps an obscure sounding question now. I hope it will be less obscure in about 30 minutes. But wanting to get your endorphins going, I thought I should do something completely now. Is there an on-off here?
Oh, that's on mine. Here,
Ah, there we are.
Too much technology.
The story of my life. Women are sorting out the technology so that I don't have to fumble with it. And there we are. I wanted to start with a bit of local history from Vancouver, where I now live. In 1964, the Vancouver Aquarium commissioned a sculptor who had also worked as a commercial fisherman to kill an orca. The idea was that the sculptor would use the carcass of the orca to sculpt a lifelike replica to hang in the entrance foyer of the museum. And so the sculptor set up a harpoon gun on an island where orcas were known to pass, amidst great hoopla and media attention. And there he waited and waited and waited. Finally, months later, after the media were long gone and all the hubbub had died down, the aquarium got an unexpected phone call. The sculptor had harpooned an orca. It was struggling vigorously on the line, but it showed no sign of dying, and he didn't know what to do next. So they made the quick decision to tow the orca 40 miles by the harpoon line embedded in its body, back to Vancouver to a temporary holding place, and there the orca became a kind of international celebrity. 20,000 people flocked to see it on the first day that public viewing was allowed. Stories about it appeared in Time, Life, Newsweek, major media around the world. Well, the orca died after 75 days, but the public interest was so great that the aquarium decided to build a large tank, and for the next 30 years, live, wild-caught orcas were the star attractions of the aquarium. Then by the 1990s, the mood seemed to change, and the aquarium found itself faced with controversy. The public, the media, some of their own paying customers, wondering whether it was all right to keep these intelligent social animals isolated in captivity. And after a long debate, they decided that they would no longer keep wild-caught orcas. And the last one was transferred to a facility in San Diego where she would at least have other orcas for company and some more space. The transfer happened in 2001 during a provincial election in British Columbia. And it was interesting to see that the orca received about as much media attention and certainly more genuine public interest than any of the political candidates. In fact, if the orca had run in the election, then back in 2001, I think British Columbia might have just edged out California as the first West Coast jurisdiction to be governed by a large muscular entertainment figure. Well, I like this story because it shows how much has changed from a time when harpooning an orca was a really interesting project to a time when just keeping an orca in captivity became a matter of public debate. But the breathtaking thing is that this change has happened within the lifetime of many of the people in this room. And it's affected attitudes toward how we treat animals in biomedical research, wildlife management, and of course agriculture. And it leaves us with the question of how we should respond then to this changed public perception. So in this talk, I wanted to first begin with a historic debate that will first seem irrelevant, but which I think sets the tone for a lot of what's happening today. Then ask how that applies to the intensification of animal production. Then ask whether our existing programs and responses to concern about animal welfare are working, and then propose that some kind of professional animal production is a promising way forward. All right, this is a very strange way to start a talk about animal welfare, but I want to begin with a debate that arose during the Industrial Revolution, because I really think it sets the stage for what we're seeing today. Well, during the 17 and 1800s, as you know, these sort of factories became the standard way of producing textiles and other manufactured goods throughout Europe, and it led to a huge upheaval in society. Traditional workers operating their hand looms in their homes could no longer compete with these new, cheaper manufactured textiles, and they were, in many cases, forced by economic necessity to relocate to cities, which were often crowded and unhealthy, and work in factories which were often oppressive and dangerous. It was a profound social change, and it caused a debate between two clashing sets of values. One set of values we might call agrarian. This is people living, a set of values associated with people living in the country in harmony with nature and the land. There's a long tradition in Western thought that agrarian living brings out the best in human beings. Aristotle, 2,500 years ago, commented on how the agricultural population is the most virtuous, and that farming sets the stage for democracy to work. He wrote, "The best common people are the agricultural population, so that it is possible to introduce democracy as well as other forms of constitution, where the multitude lives by agriculture or by pasturing cattle." One of the more modern exponents of agrarian values was Thomas Jefferson in the US, one of the founding figures in the American Constitution, who argued that the US should remain an agricultural population and not industrialize because of the benefits that that brings. Here it is, "Let our workshops," meaning the factories, "remain in Europe. It is better to carry provisions and materials to workmen there. The loss by the transportation of commodities across the Atlantic will be made up in happiness and permanence of government." It's not a platform we hear very often from politicians today, but the idea has certainly persisted. Here was Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Louis Bromfield around 1950. "The good farmer is one of the ultimate peaks of evolution. He is the one citizen without whom mankind and civilization cannot exist." And coming a lot closer to the present, poet Wendell Berry, writing in 2002, calling for a return to agrarian living in the hope that we might become a healthy people in a healthy land. Agrarian values. Related to those are what we might call romantic values, not in a pejorative sense, not in a negative sense, but in a historic sense, meaning values, first of all, that reverence nature. So here we have a painter who is not doing the traditional portraits, not doing the traditional religious scenes, simply making a painting of nature because that was what was of value. Romantic values tend to see this contact with nature as benefiting people, that valued freedom. Like agrarianism, it valued rural life, and it valued emotion, even emotion in animals, shown here by George Stubbs, one of many paintings that George Stubbs made showing a fanciful theme of a horse being frightened by a lion, and Landseer's touching scene of the old shepherd dog mourning by the coffin of the dead shepherd. If we were to combine these two related sets of values, we would see a worldview then that values a simple, basic life, that sees nature as an ideal that we should try to return to, that values emotion ahead of the rationality and technology that gave rise to industrialism, that values the freedom of the individual, not the regimentation of the factories, and that tends to look back toward a golden age in the past when people lived richer lives that were simpler and closer to nature. Does that make sense? Okay, at that time, of course, there were opponents of the Romantics and Agrarians who were enthusiastic about industrialization and technology. They brought in two ideas that were then relatively new in Western thought. One was productivity. Adam Smith began this famous book by arguing that the quality of life in a nation depends on the amount of goods that are available to meet the needs and wants of the people. And if we can increase the productivity of the workforce and thereby increase the amount of goods that are available, this will lead to a better life. So Smith was in favor of industrialization, increasing productivity, and hence improving the quality of life of people. Second idea was progress. The idea that change always moves in the direction of improvement. According to the historian who wrote this book, the concept of progress began in science, probably in the 1600s, because in science each generation was seen as building on the knowledge of the previous generation, so that scientific knowledge should always progress. During the 1700s, the word became something of a buzzword, almost a rule of life. In the words of this historian, people by 1800 were looking for progress in wealth, in civilization, in social organization, in art and literature, and even in human nature. So if we were to try to capture this pro-industrial, pro-technology worldview, it might look rather like this. Instead of valuing a simple, basic life, it valued a life improved by science and technology. Instead of seeing nature as an ideal, it saw nature as an imperfect state that we should try to control and improve on. It valued rationality rather than irrational emotion. It valued the productivity of the enterprise more than the freedom of the individual worker. And it tended to look toward a golden age in the future when progress through science and technology would lead to greater productivity and a better life for all. Right? So now a question. I would like each of you to decide which of these, or neither, best fits with your own worldview. So if you value a simple, basic life, ideally lived in the country, if you see nature as an ideal state that we should try to emulate, if you value emotion and the freedom of the individual and tend to look back to the good old days when things were better because they were simpler, then vote romantic agrarian. We're going to do a show of hands. If you value life improved by science and technology, if you see nature as imperfect and feel that we should improve on it and control it, if you value rationality more than emotion, if you value productivity and look forward to a better life in the future through science, technology, and progress, then vote industrial. And if you're somewhere in between, vote conflicted. Right? 3 choices: romantic agrarian, industrial, or conflicted. Now the question, how many are voting romantic agrarian? Thank you. In a general public audience, you would have a lot of company. Industrial? Slightly more in a group like this. How about conflicted? Yeah, you get the point. Now, this debate continues, of course, and affects us in many ways, in the debate between scientific medicine and alternative medicine, production agriculture and organic agriculture, country living versus city living. And what we see by the show of hands is that this is not just a debate going on between this person and that person. It's actually a debate going on within our own minds. And of course, these different ideas about what is the best kind of human life then precondition different ideas about what is the best kind of life for animals, that is, different conceptions of what's important for animal welfare. So for some people, drawing on the romantic agrarian worldview, a good life for animals must first and foremost be a natural life with freedom, outdoors, sunshine, free range, that sort of thing. For many people influenced more on the industrial side, a good life for animals must be first and foremost a healthy life, marked by good functioning of the body, control of disease and injury, and of course, high levels of productivity. And for others, perhaps influenced more by the emphasis on emotion of the Romantics, a good life for animals must first and foremost be a happy life with contentment, comfort, low stress, and good management of pain. And I think the fact that different people attach different weights to those interpretations of animal welfare explain a lot of what goes on in our debates. So to many in the public, the free-range chicken, because it appears natural, must be the happiest and healthiest life. To many producers with confinement systems, the healthiness is the important part, even if that's achieved in unnatural ways, and so on. But I think the other point for us is that all three of these views of what's important for animal welfare are deeply ingrained in our culture. And when we draw up animal welfare standards and practices, we need to find a balance among the three if those standards and practices are going to be widely accepted as good for animal welfare. All right. It wasn't possible, of course, for the critics of industrialism to turn the clock back to an agrarian society. But they had a second concern where they made some really significant progress. And this, of course, was over the welfare of the workers. Many of them, in the early days, children and women, working long hours in what we today would consider intolerable conditions. Just one example, a debate in 1833 in the UK Parliament over whether to regulate factory environments. A person giving testimony in favor of regulation said, referring to the child workers, "Drowsy and exhausted, the poor creatures fall too often among the machinery, which is not in many instances sufficiently sheathed, when their muscles are lacerated, their bones broken, or their limbs torn off." Well, the response to this, the policy response, was a series of acts of Parliament, collectively called the Factory Acts, which for the most part tried to make the environments safer and healthier, and at the same time reduce exposure times. So, for example, 1802 saw an act requiring ventilation and cleaning of factories. 1844, machinery had to be fenced. 1901, workers were to be protected from dust and fumes. Also 1901, people had to have 7 cubic meters per person of airspace in order to have better air quality. And the other thing was the amount of exposure time. 1819 set the 12-hour maximum workday for children aged 9 to 16. That 1833 debate led to the 9-hour day for children under 13. 1847, a 10-hour day for women. And finally, by 1878, no children under 10 were meant to be working in factories. So even if society couldn't turn the clock back to an agrarian lifestyle, at least they could create some protection of the welfare of the workers in the factories. All right, what does this have to do with intensive animal production. And basically, I think what we are seeing today in the debate over intensive animal production is almost an exact replay of the debate that occurred 100 and 200 years ago in response to industrialization. But first of all, what do we mean by intensification? It's a somewhat vague word, but let's suppose that it means three things. First of all, consolidation of ownership so that animals are raised on fewer larger farms. Second, some level of automation and cost cutting, belts to collect eggs, automated feeding systems, and so on. And third, usually some degree of confinement of animals, either in buildings or feedlots. What drove this? Obviously, these are processes that have been underway for the past at least 50 years in the developed countries. The causes are complex. One cause has been policy. Governments after the Second World War wanted a secure supply of food and cheap food, and animal agriculture has been spectacularly successful in achieving those objectives. Second issue was availability of labor. As higher paying jobs arose in other sectors, in manufacturing and so on, it became harder for people to secure the labor that they needed for food production. I remember one memorable summer on our own farm. We went through 4 hired men in 2 months. 3 of them went off to higher paying jobs in industry, and 1 went to jail. And of course, there was some new technology that made it possible, such as some aspects of automation, milking parlors, antibiotics, and so on. But I think intensification was strongly driven by 2 types of technology that we take for granted today that were hardly there at all in 1900 and are universal in our lives in 2000. First of these was this technology, or more specifically, this technology, the advances in refrigeration, which meant that slaughter and processing plants could handle and store and ship enormous amounts of product, often to very distant destinations. The second technology was this technology, or more specifically, this technology, which meant that those same slaughter plants could source their animals from an enormous distance, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of miles away. These 2 types of technology allowed the processing and slaughter industries to become highly consolidated. The food system started to look like an hourglass, with many producers selling to a small number of processors and slaughter plants, selling back to a large number of consumers. And the producers found themselves competing with hundreds or thousands of other producers, selling to a limited number of buyers. The result was intense competition, a tipping of commercial power, and a drastic fall in the profitability for the farmer. Here are some data from the US for profit per animal sold on US farrow to finish pig farms. In the 1970s, the average for that decade was about $21 profit to the farmer per pig sold. Those of you in the pig business, drool now. By the 1990s, that had dropped to $4 profit per pig sold, with some years with decent profits, others with horrible losses. The decade averaged out at $4, but that was inflated dollars. Taking inflation into account, the profitability had probably dropped to about 1/10 over those 2 decades. Well, under these conditions, intensification was more or less inevitable. Ownership had to consolidate because the traditional small farm wasn't producing enough money for people to live on. Automation and cost cutting were necessary in order to control production costs, and those often required some degree of confinement. Now, in many parts of the world, intensification is looked upon as a good thing. So here's a picture from Africa, where development agencies are encouraging intensification as a way for families to have a greater income, more reliable food supply, and for countries to have products that could be sold into world trade. And in that same way, many of us tend to think of intensification as a kind of modernization of animal production, which is largely beneficial. But in the industrialized countries, the public perception is that intensification is a kind of industrialization. And that has opened up the old debate about the Industrial Revolution, but applied to modern animal production. So animals have become animal machines. Farms have become factory farms. The term factory farm has so entered our language as to be almost what people say as a descriptive term. I think of it as a pejorative term. People are using it almost as a descriptive term to mean confinement agriculture. The first thing that this did was to create a debate about the loss of agrarian life. A couple of extreme quotes from the US. Replacing family farms are enormous factory farms owned by huge conglomerates. And in the past half century, animal agriculture in the US has been taken over by corporations, turning family farms into factory farms. Okay, we could spend half an hour dissecting the merits of these quotes. For one thing, they're confusing confinement with corporate ownership, however that got in there. The second, there's not much we can do about that, except that this perception of a loss of rural life and loss of the family farm in those areas, particularly in the US, where this is talked about a great deal, that has certainly played into the debate. But again, the second concern has been over welfare, in this case, animal welfare. And the policy response has been so modeled after the old factory acts in the Industrial Revolution that one British official early in the process said that they were creating a Factories Act for animals. And like the factory acts, they focused principally on the physical environment. So 1988, hens in the UK were required to have 450 square centimeters, rising throughout the EU to 550 in 2003, rising in 2012 to 750, plus a perch, nest box, and litter. Ventilation was an issue in agriculture as it was in the factories. 2010, the EU required that ammonia be less than 20 parts per million in broiler barns. And very roughly paralleling limits on how many hours people could be in the factories, we're seeing some exposure times. In the EU now, sows can be in crates for only 4 weeks, not throughout pregnancy. So the response to concerns over the welfare of animals has really followed those factory acts controlling factory safety and health from earlier generations, particularly looking at the physical environment and exposure time. So my question is, are these measures really working to safeguard animal welfare? Well, in some cases, they almost certainly help. In broiler barns, of course, one of the key issues is the amount of ammonia in the air. We know that as ammonia gets beyond about 25 parts per million, we see eye problems and respiratory illness in the birds. So a standard that limits ammonia to 25 parts per million is very likely going to help animal welfare. Similarly, in layers, we know from research that hens are very motivated to enter a nest box at the time of lay, to perch on a roost at night. And so environments that provide those amenities will almost certainly make an improvement in animal welfare if health and the other things are held constant. But when we look at many basic welfare indicators, we see something very interesting and important. Some of my colleagues are working on a large number of farms that, with dairy cattle in freestall barns. Looking at such basic things as the amount of lameness, leg lesions, and so on different farms, they've now studied 121 farms, all with Holstein cattle, all with freestalls, and here's the sort of thing we're finding. The lameness ranges from 5% of lame cows on the best farm to 85% of lame cows on the worst. Leg lesions range from 0% of cows with leg lesions on the best farm to 100% of cows with leg lesions on the worst. 50 farms from Minnesota studied severe lameness, found it on 3 to 57% of farms. 200 farms in the UK, lame and severely lame animals ranged from 0 on the best farm to 79% lame on the worst. In the case of pigs, one of the commonly monitored things is infant mortality rate, piglet mortality rate. It's looked upon as a production variable. It's also, of course, an animal welfare variable because most piglets are dying from some combination of chilling, starvation, and traumatic injury. Study in Norway, 39 farms, all using non-crate farrowing environments. Piglet deaths ranged from 5 to 24%. Study here by Bob Friendship in Ontario, 10 to 32%. 83 organic farms in Europe, 0 to 50% piglet mortality. One more example, deaths, lameness, leg lesions, and foot lesions. These are often monitored in broiler chickens. Here was a study of 114 flocks. Deaths ranged from 1.4% on the best farm to 14% mortality on the worst, a tenfold increase. Lameness 0 to 90%, leg lesions 0 to 80%, foot lesions 0 to 88%. Another study, foot lesions 0 to 72%. A third study, 176 flocks with lameness 0 to 84%. Okay, I've been trying to numb you with numbers just to show how universal this finding is, that when we do a comparison of a large number of farms with very simple measures that are clearly welfare indicators, we see an enormous range. And now I'm not in any way trying to detract from the fact that these studies were done to identify risk factors and so on. There's good science there, but it can all be summarized for my purposes in a tweet. In fact, the best science can be expressed in tweets. The world is round. The planets orbit the sun. So here's my tweet. Very different welfare outcomes occur in the same type of physical environment, right? Whatever species we look at, whatever standards we create for the nature of the environment, we will see, when we compare many farms using that standardized environment, very different welfare outcomes. Well, why is this? Well, the simple answer, of course, is another tweet, which is that the welfare of animals depends not only on the physical environment, but on the quality of animal care, which depends in turn, I think I'm out of characters for my tweet here, which depends in turn on the skill and knowledge and attentiveness of the producer and staff. So, in the case of those lameness figures for dairy cattle, lameness depends on maintenance of the bedding because cows rest more if the bedding is well maintained. On hygiene because walking in mucky alleyways can spread pathogens. On nutrition because nutrition that isn't well matched to the needs of the cow can lead to metabolic disturbances that affect hoof structure. On animal handling because unskillful handling can lead to injuries as animals turn. Piglet mortality depends on providing warm, draft-free environments, timely fostering, assisting weak piglets, assisting sows skillfully in long parturition. Hygiene, because in an unhygienic environment you may have a higher incidence of mastitis and a failure of milk supply. And then, of course, in the broiler barn, maintaining temperature, humidity, litter, moisture, ventilation, placement of the heaters, feed composition, lighting program, and so on. So much of the standards that have worked their way into the kind of regulations that I listed have really focused on the physical environment, whereas animal welfare depends on so much more: nutrition, healthcare, genetic selection, handling. And these things interact. So a loose housing system for sows may be a good welfare system if the feeding and feed delivery system allows the sows to have equal access to food. A certain kind of handling may be appropriate with one type of genetic selection and not with another, and so on. And this creates a very complex set of demands requiring a high level of skill, knowledge, and attentiveness on the basis of the producers and staff. In industrialization, where people were in a factory for only part of their time, controlling the physical properties of the environment and the exposure time was a reasonable approach to improving the welfare of the people in that environment. When animals are spending all of their lives under human care, there are so many more factors, and the human component is so much more important. So this brings me to what I want to call professional animal production, because the good news is that animal production doesn't have to be either agrarian or industrial as the only two alternatives. A third model would be a profession of animal production. The professions is a kind of new, relatively new model of occupations. It developed particularly during the 1900s. I think it achieved its most sophisticated form in the healthcare professions, and what an evolution it has had. So in about 1840, when Florence Nightingale declared that she wanted to become a nurse, by all reports, her family and friends were horrified. Being a nurse wasn't quite as bad as being an actress or a prostitute, but it was certainly something that no respectable young lady at that time would do. She went on about 15 years later to found the first ever school of nursing. And then about 50 years after her famous time trying to improve nursing standards in the earlier Crimean War, some countries began to have registered nurses, a law passed to recognize registered nurses as a registered profession. I think doctors and surgeons have had an even more amazing transformation. 100 years ago, a person with a herd of 100 beef cattle would have a higher income than a doctor or surgeon, probably a higher level of respect in society. In the meantime, of course, the doctors and surgeons managed to organize themselves into a profession, achieve a high level of public trust, and some obvious economic benefits. Well, what's a profession? They aren't all the same, but let's take three traits. In a profession, the main outcome generally is some form of service to clients or the public. Participation requires competence, typically demonstrated to peers. And the ethical acceptability of what they do comes from adhering to the ethical norms of society through usually some kind of professional self-regulation. We could compare this with an industrial model. Again, industries aren't all the same, but to characterize a bit, industries, rather than necessarily producing a service, produce products for sale. Some of them are a service and some of them are not. Participation requires market success rather than competence demonstrated to peers, and the ethical acceptability comes from obeying regulations rather than self-regulation. We trust professions to self-regulate, we regulate industries. So by these criteria, could animal production become a profession? Well, first of all, are animal producers providing a service, or are they just producing products that they try to flog? 50 years ago, with Green Revolution technology, grain became so abundant and so cheap that we saw an explosion of grain-based animal production, and we saw the pork sector competing with the beef sector for an increase in market share, looking an awful lot like Ford versus GM. Today, the predictions are that our food production capacity is going to fall below demands because of world population growth, climate change, and so on. And I think this extra demand is going to make food production look less like an industry vying for market share and more like a profession providing an important service to the public. Competence. People can't just decide to be doctors, they have to demonstrate their ability to other doctors. Could this possibly apply to animal producers? Well, years ago, again going back 50 years, it would have been inconceivable. The general belief 50 years ago was that anybody could farm, and millions did. The 1941 census in Canada showed nearly 500,000 farms with pigs. Average 13 pigs per farm. Today, how many pig farms have we got? Fewer than 10,000. About a quarter as many pig farms as there are doctors in the country. So of course this is a highly specialized business where a person to really excel needs a high level of specialized skill and knowledge, but as we saw from the data, the actual performance is variable. Adherence to ethical norms. Here again, I think we're in transition. The standard model until recently has been, if there's an animal welfare problem on a farm, the police or the SPCA come in and pinch the offender. We've now seen a shift where, in many cases, SPCAs and producer organizations have some kind of agreement so that producers are involved in on-farm calls so that the law enforcement people have producer expertise available. Imagine taking that one step further so that it is the producer organization itself that gets the calls, and they bring in the SPCA in those cases where they really need some law enforcement activity for the rare and intractable cases. That would move us an awful lot closer to the situation of the doctors who do almost all of their self-policing themselves, and the law becomes involved only in the extremes. Well, I think in these three respects, animal production is still a ways from being a profession, but is already taking steps in that direction. What would it achieve for animal production to become a profession? Well, I think three things. First of all, I think it is a far more powerful model for improving animal welfare than regulating physical environments and exposure times. Second, I think it would increase public trust in animal producers. And third, I think it would give animal producers much more sense of ownership over the whole process. Okay. What can we conclude from a talk that has gone from the Industrial Revolution and Aristotle to lameness in chickens? Let me suggest 6 things. First of all, that our culture has 2 sets of values, romantic agrarian, emphasizing nature, emotion, and rural life, and industrial, emphasizing technology, productivity, and progress, and that those are in conflict between us and within ourselves, and that these different views, these different philosophies have given rise to different views of animal welfare, one emphasizing a natural life, one emphasizing a healthy and productive life, one emphasizing a happy life with comfort, contentment, and pain control. And because these views of animal welfare are deeply embedded in our culture. The standards and practices we promote to improve animal welfare need to strike a balance among the three. Intensification in the industrialized countries is widely perceived as a kind of industrialization, and it's given rise to two concerns, much as happened 200 years ago: the loss of rural life and welfare, in this case the welfare of animals. That animal welfare reforms have been largely modeled on worker welfare legislation that regulated the physical environment and exposure time in factories. But in animal production, the same type of environment can produce very different welfare outcomes because animal welfare is greatly affected by the quality of animal care. And shifting animal production toward a professional model is a more promising approach to improving animal welfare and maintaining public trust in animal producers. And for those of you who fell asleep, you can actually read this in the book Understanding Animal Welfare and in a recent piece that I did called Could Animal Production Become a Profession?, which I can send to you. Thank you very much.